Hi everyone, I'm Taysa Brown. I'm the Provincial Silviculture Performance Assessment Specialist with the Forest Science Planning and Practices branch. This video covers a What's New 2022 training session. It will focus on changes to the Silviculture Survey Manual. It will explain how to survey using the new 2022 survey methodologies. All right, let's begin. Section 7, Data Collection.
Okay, so Table 9 on page 79 outlines precision standards and allowable errors. I simply italicized some of the data elements to indicate that they were non-legal thresholds. So the italicized attributes are not included in the results information submission specifications precision standards. Next, section 7.4, inventory label background. I'd highly recommend watching the Rationales for 2022 Reporting a Survey Updates video to better understand how the inventory label gets used and why we needed to modify the procedures. But in case you don't, I'll give you the main details. In 2021, the Free Growing Working Group completed a data needs assessment. The group consulted with program areas like growth and yield, carbon, forest health, wildlife, wildfire, forest investments, etc., to understand what data is currently being used, how it should be changed, and what other data elements would be meaningful. Our meetings with the growth and yield team were particularly enlightening because the yield curve development process has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. They are now developing a unique yield curve for every single opening using planting information, inventory density, and inventory species composition. They are now more reliant on silviculture survey data than ever before, so it's critical that we're providing them with data that they can rely on. Unfortunately, they expressed a number of concerns, and they weren't alone. The feedback was surprisingly consistent across the program areas, especially for inventory species composition. Every single program area is reliant on it, and yet they all deemed its precision to be too low. They were concerned about the 20% precision standard, indicating that there was too much room for error. They were unhappy with the rounding, since it unnecessarily reduces the precision and means that minor species aren't always being captured. They also informed us that species composition for mature layers should be based on basal area, not volume, to align with the VRI. Everyone was also strongly opposed to visual estimates, highlighting issues with observer bias, the lack of repeatability, the disconnect that can occur between density and species composition, and the tendency to overestimate minor species and underestimate shorter trees. They all suggested plot-based measures to improve the data quality. And that's why all aspects of the inventory label will now be based on data collected from within the plot area. The biggest change involves using tree counts by species to determine species composition for layers 2, 3, and 4. With this update, we can also begin to look at measures of dispersion so that we can actually capture the spatial distribution of species in the future. This was also deemed highly important by all program areas. That measure would help us communicate that in this upper image, the aspen is highly clumped, whereas in this lower image, it's more randomly distributed. And those different spatial dispersions have meaningful impacts on long-term values like volume and wildfire resiliency.
Moving on, we have section 7.5.1 covering plot types. This section explains when different data elements should be collected. To help remember it, you can categorize your plots as count plots and full measure plots. Your count plots are simpler and happen more frequently. They are equal to the second, third, fourth, sixth, seventh, eighth, 10th, etc. plots. At them, you will always collect total stems by species and well-spaced by species. The other data elements, all italicized, need to be collected if applicable. So it will depend on your stand conditions and your survey objective. These data elements include free-to-grow tallies by species, forest health, number in, countable heights and conifers, germinants, and plantable and preparable spots. Then you have full measure plots. They are slower and involve more data collection, so they only happen every fourth plot. For example, plot 1, 5, 9, 13, etc. At minimum, there should be 3 full measure plots per stratum. At these plots, you collect everything applicable from the count plot, plus inventory heights and ages, crown closure, silviculture height and age, and competing vegetation. Now, sometimes the leading or secondary species isn't present at the full measure plot. If that happens, you can do the age and height measurements at the next count plot with the target tree species present. All right, this is the new FS 658 plot card. I'll just be highlighting a few key changes. Again, to learn how to fill it out, please watch the 2023 FS 658 and FS 659 updates video. So I'll really be just focusing on this data type or layer column. So this card shows data from an even age clear cut. So we have three rows, or three types of rows. We have a T row, a W row, and an F row. If you're collecting data in a multi-layered stand, you might break that out by layer. So for example, you could have a T1, a T2, a T3, a T4, an F1, F2, F3, F4. And then for each layer, the T would represent your inventory information. So you have your total tree counts, you have your inventory heights and ages for your leading and secondary species, you have crown closure, plantable spots, and then depending on what's ticked up here, you have germinants or number in. Then for your W row, all the data is reflective of the well-spaced information for whatever layer you're collecting data on. So here are our well-spaced tree tallies. If we had heights and ages here, they'd be reflective of the well-spaced trees. And then finally, we have our F row. Everything in this row is reflective of free growing information. So these are our free growing tallies, free growing heights and ages. So over the next few slides, I'll be talking about the data collection procedures that have changed over the last few years that link to this plot card. Okay, let's talk tree tallies. This is probably the most significant change. We are no longer basing our inventory species composition off ocular estimates. Instead, when we use plot-based sampling methods, we will base it off tree tallies by species. And this will be done at every single plot. This will apply for all single layer SUs or for layers 2, 3, and 4 from multi-layer SUs. Same as always, our tree tallies will include all living commercial trees, and a commercial tree can be considered any species listed in the section 6 of the FS 660 or the results tree list. And there's both conifer and broadleaf species included. We count absolutely everything except for germinants, and I'll define germinant on the next slide. So we are tallying healthy trees and unhealthy, small trees and large trees, good quality trees and poor quality trees, everything, and it's all being done by species. Now, if you have a multi-layer stand, you need to handle the layer 1 trees differently. The provincial VRI, the Vegetation Resource Inventory, bases species composition off basal area for mature trees, so we need to align with that. So when you're collecting data in a multi-layer stand, you need to do a basal area sweep and record the number in by species at every plot. And like the last slide, you're counting all in trees, so all species, all quality, all levels of vigor. Next, I mentioned that tree tallies by species include everything but germinants. So it's important to understand the definition of a germinant. This has changed since 2022. It's been simplified based on feedback. A germinant is less than or equal to a 5 centimeter natural. So if you have a seedling that is greater than 5 centimeters, it's counted as a tree. Equally, if you have a planted seedling that's under 5 centimeters due to browse or some other damage, it's still considered a tree, not a germinant. Now, there's one special clause. If you take a less than 5 centimeter natural as a crop tree, as well spaced, then count it as a tree, not a germinant. That's needed because your total tree counts have to equal or exceed your well-spaced numbers. All right, example time. So the two photos on the left are both trees, not germinants. As you can see with the measuring tape, they're both greater than 5 centimeters. The example on the far right is a germinant. It's naturally regenerated and it's less than or equal to 5 centimeters. So to be counted as a germinant, it would not be included in the tree tallies by species. Now, how exact do you need to be? Well, if you're writing your accreditation exam, I would pull out your measuring tape so that you can be confident in your call on every single seedling. However, day to day, we want us to speed up surveys, not slow them down. So find something they can use to gauge whether or not it's a germinant or a tree. For me, my thumb is pretty close to 5 centimeters, so I'd start off using that. Now remember, you do need to be within 20% of an auditor for species composition and total density. So you have some wiggle room, but you want to make sure that you're within that range. While germinants will not be counted under your tree tallies by species, so right here, you may still wish to count them, but it would depend on the stand's age and stocking level. So for example, if you're surveying to declare an SU free growing, there would be no value in counting germinants. But if you're doing a natural regeneration assessment or a survival survey, it could be highly valuable. Maybe you're in a wildfire area and you find really low well-spaced numbers. It's NSR, but there's a sea of germinants. You would want to know that because that means your well-spaced numbers could drastically increase if you resurveyed the stratum in another year. So you would not want to prescribe a plant without resurveying it, or you could end up wasting money and massively frustrating your tree planters. So if you want to track this, we've created a new column for germinants. It's split with number in, so you need to tick off what you're collecting. Similarly, if you're a SNAP user, they already have a germinates field and it comes through in their reports. So this is an optional data element, but it is strongly recommended if germinates could impact a treatment recommendation. All right, we're now going to cover inventory tree counts when you have high plot density. In the past, in these situations, you were still technically expected to count every single stem. However, you always had some wiggle room given the 20% precision standard. As a result, many surveyors would realistically count in 10s or 20s or do a quarter plot swing and multiply it out. We are now going to provide some concrete guidance in the manual. If you have 50 trees, all species combined, in your 3.99 meter plot, and this excludes germinants, then it is reasonable to estimate by species your total tree tally. I just want to emphasize that we're not switching back to ocular estimates in these situations. Instead, we are estimating the number of trees present within the plot by species. So for the example on this slide, there's clearly over 50 trees, but it's not outrageously dense. As a result, I would probably start to count the balsam and the hemlock in 5s or maybe 10s. Using those counts, I then estimate that there's 25 balsam and 55 hemlock in my plot, and I'd enter it under total trees right here. Now, just as a reminder, you need to make sure that you're using a method that provides you a reasonable, accurate estimate because you're still going to be expected to hit the Reese precision standard. All right, moving on, let's talk about height and age requirements. So first, with our inventory label, we need to do inventory heights and ages for both the stratum's leading and secondary inventory species. This has not changed from previous years. What has changed is the requirement for the silviculture label. The silviculture height and age will now reflect the stratum's leading silviculture species. Previously, it was not linked to an individual species, so that is the change. For both the inventory height and age measurements and the silviculture height and age measurements, we recommend completing them at your full measure plots, and we recommend doing at least 3 measurements per stratum. You should be determining the leading and second inventory species and leading silviculture species during your walkthrough and file review. If you do not complete the walkthrough and are uncertain, you may need to collect height and age measurements for additional species. If you do, it would be great if you could submit those additional height and age measurements to results. Also, you may choose to always collect heights and ages for all species because it can be really helpful. For example, you can use the silviculture heights and ages by species to check that minimum heights have been hit for free growing. You can also use them to predict free growing timing and to understand growth rates. So, for inventory heights and ages, what trees are getting measured? From within your 3.99 meter radius plot, you're going to select the tallest, excluding residuals, living tree for the target species. Then you measure its height and age. You need to use the same sample tree for both the height measurement and age determination. Now, I did tweak the language slightly from 2022 based on FABE, Forest Analysis and Inventory Branch's feedback. I dropped the word healthy and I changed it to living. FABE emphasized that the inventory should reflect all trees, regardless of their health status, so this better aligns with how they do the VRI. Next, we have silviculture height and age. It will now reflect the leading silviculture species. In the 2020 manual and earlier versions, it wasn't actually linked to an individual species, so this is a significant change. If your stratum is free-growing, you will pick the stratum's leading free-growing species. If your stratum is SR, you will pick the leading well-spaced species. Then, at your full measure plots, you will pick a representative well-spaced or free-growing tree of the desired species from within your 3.99 meter radius plot, and you will measure its height and age. Now, in previous versions of the manual, it said to pick an average tree from the plot. Most people interpreted that as a representative well-spaced or representative free-growing tree, but it could be interpreted as the mathematical average. So to prevent any confusion going forward or any misinterpretation, I've changed the wording to representative. For all height measurements, silviculture, and inventory, we now measure from the point of germination to the top of the dominant leader of the selected tree. During the active growing season, we include the leader growth, so any in-season partial growth in this height measurement. Next, crown closure. Now, unfortunately, crown closure is really hard to do accurately. If you have recent aerial imagery available, that's your best bet. So for example, if you have a drone and you popped up in the air to do pre-stratification, that would be an amazing option. You can then visually compare your images to the diagrams in the FS660. Also, if you want to get your eye in check, you can run some of the photos through an app like Canopio, which is free. The image in the middle is actually from Canopio, and it corresponds to the photo on the right, which is from a drone. Based on the Canopio analysis, there's 54% crown closure. Now, to be more accurate, I definitely should have snipped out the road, but that still seems pretty reasonable when you compare it to the images from the FS660 at the top. Now, if you don't have recent aerial images, then you'll need to do ground-based estimates. You'll complete them at your full measure plots. You'll assess crown closure within your plot and the surrounding area. Now, you can report crown closure to the nearest 1%. However, based on the photo interpreters, it's not really necessary. It is completely acceptable to round to the nearest 5%. So, if you're doing a regeneration delay assessment, don't agonize over whether it's 2% or 5% crown closure. Just round it to 5%. For accuracy, you do want to try to be within 10% of a photo interpreter. Now, the photo interpreter team did want me to emphasize that crown closure estimates really should be done during full leaf flush conditions, aka summer. Now, we're obviously not going to stop surveying in the spring, fall, and winter for the sake of crown closure, but please do keep that in mind if you're surveying in a stand with lots of broadleaf trees or larches. Next, vegetation. This typically gets recorded at your full measure plots. In 2022, I had tweaked the wording to make it based on your plot area. We are not going ahead with that. We are reverting back to the 2020 wording. So your ocular estimate will capture vegetation from within and outside your plot. Also, I'm removing the word competing. This field can be used for more than just competing vegetation. So for example, based on local level needs, you may also want to record invasive plants, medicinal or edible plants, or important forage species. Next, forest health. Forest health reporting is now mandatory at regeneration delay. So this is a major change. You will now record forest health on all trees at every plot. You will not record forest health on germinants. Like free growing, you will tally one forest health factor per tree, so you will need to pick the most impactful forest health factor. If you're uncertain what forest health factor would have longer or more damaging impact, reach out to your regional pathologist or entomologist. Now, it's important to note that trees with reportable forest health damage at regeneration delay can still be taken as well spaced. It does not impact their well space status. However, you should not be taking trees with so much damage that they won't survive or meet free growing at subsequent surveys. You don't want to mislead anyone on the stalking levels. So, for example, a pine tree with rust on the main stem will never be a free growing tree given the free growing damage criteria. So don't take it as well spaced at regeneration delay. Now, the free growing damage criteria do not apply at regeneration delay, and that's because they weren't designed for super young trees. So we're basically recording all forest health damage, but we don't want to waste anyone's time. So if a tree has really minor damage, you do not need to report it. So what is really minor damage? Well, if a tree maybe has a lateral branch that has been browsed, but it has no wounds, galls, cankers, or mistletoe, it has a living leader, has normal growth above and below ground, and it has good color and needle retention for its age and species, then you don't need to report it. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any good photo examples of this because apparently I only take photos of sick and dying trees. So the seedlings in these photos should all be reported. On the left, we have nursery root rot. We don't have normal growth above or below ground. The seedling is clearly chlorotic and has experienced significant needle loss. So this is reportable. Then we have an elk browse cedar. And looking at the size of the caliper, it's an older tree and it's been browsed probably year after year, and it doesn't have normal growth. So again, it needs to be reported. Then we have cedar with blight. Its color isn't normal, even for cedar, which can turn reddish, so it needs to be reported. Then we have a Doug fir seedling with a small girdle at the base from conifer seedling weevil, and that's considered a wound, so it needs to be reported. And then lastly, we have a Doug fir, and it looks honestly pretty healthy. It's clearly going to recover well. It's got good foliar color overall, but it has a dead leader and a couple dead branches. Because of the dead leader, it needs to be reported too. Now, this summer, a lot of regeneration delay surveys will be happening for areas that were planted in 2021. I suspect we'll have many trees with poor foliar color because they were affected by the heat dome and subsequent drought. You might be wondering what needs to be reported. What is the line between good and not good foliar color? Unfortunately, I can't just draw a line on these color charts because it varies by species and age. So if you're struggling, I recommend reaching out to your regional forest health specialist and ask for their input for the tree species that are most common in your operating area. Now, at regeneration delay, we're not using the free grind damage criteria, and well-spaced trees can have reportable forest health damage. But at free growing, we are applying the free growing damage criteria, and free growing trees cannot have reportable forest health damage. So how do we handle intermediate non-legal stalking surveys? Well, they are non-legal, so it is up to you. But my recommendation would be to treat the survey like a regeneration delay survey if you won't be tallying any free growing information. So if your trees are really small still. If you will be collecting some free growing data, maybe you have 400 stems per hectare free growing, then treat it like a free growing survey and only record forest health damage that exceeds the damage criteria in the FS 660. All right, moving on. In February, I released a new Swiss needle cast data collection procedure with David Rush, our coastal pathologist. The procedure applies to coastal BC. This data should be collected in stands with greater than 50% Douglas fir or stands that were intended for Douglas fir. So for example, if you planted 80% Douglas fir, but you now only have 40% Douglas fir in the inventory due to hemlock or alder infill, you should still collect this data. To be able to follow the procedure, your trees need to be 5 years old or older. The procedure focuses on needle retention for the last 4 years. Now, if you work in coastal BC, please make sure that you check out these training videos before you head to the field. They're posted on the Forest Health playlist of this channel. Also, the data collection spreadsheet and instructions are posted on the Silviculture Surveys reference documents webpage, and it's all linked in the survey manual. All right, next, I've given the Forest Health Resources section an update. The Forest Health Specialists indicated that the old Forest Practices Code Forest Health Guidebooks are too out of date and should no longer be referenced. Instead, you should be finding information on the BC Forest Health webpage. You can find info on individual forest health factors like Swiss Mulecast, the forest health strategies, and overview surveys. They also recommended checking out the available CEDAs, the Stand Establishment Decision Aids. If you go to the GEM website and type in CEDA under the search bar, they will pop up. I've also linked CEDAs for 8 different forest health factors in the surveys manual. All right, let's move on to section 8, compilation. All right, here's the new FS 659 Silviculture Survey plot summary card. And you can see that there's far more space to calculate the different elements of the inventory label. So for example, you can sum your species tallies, and this is either tree counts or number in right here, and calculate your species composition in the row below. There's also space to record your stratum, inventory or silviculture species number 1 and 2. And there's space for your height and age and crown closure. There's also a new field for germinants and a calculation for germinants. So it's been given quite the overhaul. As a reminder, for single layer stands that will be reported under an I and an S layer to results, the inventory species composition will be calculated using the tallies by species from each plot. For multi-layer stands, you will use the tree tallies by species to calculate inventory species composition for layers 2, 3, and 4. But for layer 1, it will be based on basal area. So you will use the number in by species from all of your plots. Also, we are no longer going to be rounding species composition to the nearest 10%. Instead, we will be reporting to the nearest 1%. Unfortunately, results and the VRI can only handle 10 species. So if you're working in the Kootenays where it's possible to have more than 10 species in a single stratum, you will need to group the most minor species in with the leading species. So for the example on the slide, we have 12 species. Larch and yellow pine are the 11th and 12th species. They equate to 3% of the total density. They will need to be dropped, and the first species composition will need to be increased by 3%. So how do you actually do that? Well, if you're using SNAP, you'll need to find the plots with the most minor species and change the tree species to the leading species. So for this example, my most minor species at 3% was black spruce. So I had to go through my plots. I found my single plot that had a black spruce, and I changed the tree species code for those 2 trees to be lodgepole pine, my leading species. So you can see that I changed it right here. And then when I reran the report for the inventory label, you can see that pine is now 18% and black spruce is gone, and I'm down to 10 species. So this could transfer through to results. Otherwise, nothing else has changed. All right, next, I want to talk about vegetation, so the back side of the FS 659. So there is space to record percent cover and heights for up to 7 species. There is also columns for annual growth, distribution, current competition, and potential competition levels. Now, the competition fields, they make sense if you're recording competing vegetation species. However, maybe recorded some invasive or medicinal or edible species that aren't competitive to the crop trees. If that's the case, simply don't fill out these sections if they aren't useful to you. This whole section is for you. It doesn't get reported to the government, so fill out what makes sense. All right, so this slide is more of an FYI. In the results information submission specifications, there is an incident area field. It is required if only part of your stratum is affected by a forest health agent and is not actually grounds for stratification. Unfortunately, SNAP, SAP, and many licensee databases do not have this field. So this is really just a heads up that you might need to track it in your notes or recommendation section so that someone can manually enter it, if applicable, into results. All right, next I want to highlight a reporting change that will affect your stratum comments or recommendations. Starting in 2023, it is mandatory to report the objective code for any replants or fill plants caused by drought or frost. The objective code will be the same as the usual pest code, so NG for frost and ND for drought. When I informed licensees of this change last winter, many expressed interest in reporting other causes so that the government could better understand their forest health problems. If you want to do that, you can. There's many options to choose from. For example, A for animal damage, AC for cattle damage, DL for disease-caused dieback, IW for weevils, etc. But it's entirely up to you. The only ones that are mandatory are NG or ND if applicable. Okay, so how have all of these different changes affected the inventory label? Well, you'll notice that our new label has no rounding for the species composition. Also, the species composition might be slightly different because it's now based on tree counts by species at each plot, and it excludes germinates. Also, if the survey was completed during the active growing season, your heights might be slightly different too, because they now include in-season partial growth. Also, the heights and ages will be based on the tallest living trees in the plot versus the DOM, CODOM. Finally, the inventory density might be slightly less because it will exclude germinates. Next, how will the silviculture label change? Well, the silviculture height and age will now be reflective of the leading species. So in this example, the free-growing fir trees are 1.5 and 12 years old, and that's what's showing up in the label. The heights might also appear slightly taller if the survey is done during the active growing season because they will include leader growth. Site index and site index source will no longer be part of the silviculture label since they don't actually get submitted to results and they aren't used by anyone. All right, now I'm just going to touch on stats for a quick second. On this slide, you can see a little clip from the FS 660 and then the 1138. So on the FS 660, we used to have a column for number of plots and then also for DF. And for people without a stats background, I think that confused them quite a bit. So for both cards, we've made a change. We've dropped the DF column and we've changed the instructions so that's find the t-value for n, just to simplify. So both cards have been changed in that way. For the 1138A, you'll also notice that it's been color coded. And I'm hoping if you're using it, you'll print it off in color. And I'm hoping it'll make it a little bit easier to follow the formulas if you're mathematically challenged. So just trying to make it as easy as possible. And then lastly, in the manual, there's now 2 stratum examples. I just wanted to add in one example where you needed to calculate how many more plots were required because you had an uncertain stocking decision. And I just want to emphasize when you're using this formula right here, the e-value has to be the per plot e-value, not the per hectare e-value, or the number of new plots just won't make sense. So hopefully that helps. Good luck. And at some point, I will get a stats video up on this channel to help you out too. All right, next I want to cover results reporting for declarations. Bill 23 was passed in November 2021, and it amended FERPA. The amendment now makes written declarations mandatory for regeneration delay and free growing. I think most people already thought that was a legal requirement, so it shouldn't impact most licensees. Nevertheless, this is important, so I just wanted to make sure everybody understood this obligation. Now, it does say a written declaration, but you don't actually have to physically write anything down and submit it. You just need to use the milestone declaration window in results. I also want to highlight FPPR 97.7. It says that a current forest cover update is required when a milestone declaration is submitted. So what does current mean? Well, when asked, the results team has always said that means within 18 months. So you can use that as your guidance. And that is it for section 7 and 8. If anything is unclear, please reach out. My email is provided on this slide. I'd be happy to help. Also, it'd be a sign that I need to improve the wording in the manual, so you'd be helping me out too. Now, if there's any chance that you'll be surveying stands with some dispersed retention, please make sure to watch the What's New 2023 Section 9 video. It focuses on the alternative survey methods like multi-story, DFP, layered, and CEDRIS.